There are a number of concerns that people who are reading, working their way through studying philosophical texts will often raise, and these can cause a lot of anxiety or embarrassment, shame, anger, all sorts of negative emotions. They all turn around one central question: how long should it take me to read this text, this particular text? And, I'm going to say this at the very end. The answer is, well, it all depends, and you have to figure that out for yourself depending on what it is that you're trying to get out of the text. So there's a lot of different variations to this. I've had some students recently who talked about, laboring under the idea that they should be able to read things a lot quicker than they actually are, and they're surprised that a text takes them so long, but they were also pleasantly surprised about how much they were getting out of it. And then I also saw, somebody who's sort of a peer saying, I tried reading Hegel's Phenomenology in the past in this particular reading group, and we didn't get through it that well because we were trying to do it in a given time frame. And I think we could go on and on and on with examples about this sort of thing. The basic idea that a lot of people have is that there's some normal or standard or optimal or good amount of time that you should be spending on this particular text or thinker. And it might be, similar to other texts and thinkers. And if you're not doing it that way, there's something wrong with you. And I just want to say that's not the case at all. And as a matter of fact, thinking that way can actually be quite counterproductive for you as you go through studies. So to go back to the Hegel issue, the person had said, we did this summer phenomenology of spirit reading group, and, I found that reading the phenomenology on my own, at my own pace, I'm actually getting a lot more out of it. And why is this the case? So this is a bit of an idiosyncrasy, right? Hegel's phenomenology starts out with a preface, which everybody wants to read, an introduction, which many people kind of skip over. The very first two parts, consciousness and self-consciousness, are not all that long, right? And there's some cool stuff happening in there. Fourth is in the understanding, the master-slave dialectic, all that kind of stuff. And then we get into these two massive sections, reason and spirit. And they're, the bulk of the work. And then there's another long section, religion, and then you get this really short section at the end, absolute knowing. So you're going to start out in the summer, you got to start here and do this stuff, and you got to end up here. What ends up happening? People give short shrift to those big chunks in the middle. They try to go too fast, too far in too short a time, and they don't really get that much out of it. And this can even happen in a semester-long class. The Phenomenology of Spirit, if you're really going to go through it carefully, it might take you longer than a semester as an academic class. Some places actually teach it over the course of an entire year, which could be a little bit too long, right? So, and that's just one example. How long should it take you to go through Heidegger's Being and Time, Sartre's Being and Nothingness, Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation, Descartes' Meditations? Descartes' Meditations is quite quick. And you could say with that one, well, Descartes himself is doing this like day 1, day 2, day 3. I could maybe do it in a week, and that's true. But how long should it take you to go through Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or Plato's Republic? There aren't standard answers to this, and there's good reasons why there aren't. And the idea that you can somehow set a time limit is a bit screwy. And I think that, where does this idea come from? So there's probably multiple sources for this, but I think that in the age of the internet, we're probably more vulnerable to this line of thinking because there's lots of people out there talking about this. Oh, we're going to do a reading group on this summer. We're going to get through all of this. That makes you think, yeah, that's a good idea. And you start comparing yourself with other people. So other people might say, it took me this long to read this book. And if you take longer, you're like, oh, is there something wrong with me? If you get it done quicker, you might say, did I get everything that I'm supposed to? And so I think comparisons with others in this, they can be useful in a very rough sense. Like if you ask somebody who knows something about philosophy, hey man, how long is it going to take me to get through this particular text? And they say, well, it took me about this amount of time, and I was reading about this amount each day or each week. You think they're pretty similar to me. That could actually be helpful. But if you're going to like go by what some philosophy graduate student is doing, who gets to study texts, basically full time, and you got a day job and responsibilities, and you're just getting in some reading early in the morning or at night after you've put the kids to bed, it's not the same thing at all. And, there's a lot of differences that we want to take into account. So what you're going to find on the internet is there's way too many people who you probably shouldn't listen to, because they're going to give you information which in a very limited sense could be useful, true, but if you extend it outward, as they may try to tell you should do, and generalize to everybody's case, it's getting you screwed up. It's misleading. So, people will come up with ratings like, this book is a, 4 difficulty out of 10. Well, that's very relative. How difficult is Hegel's phenomenology of spirit? If you've never read anything by Hegel before, it's a 10, right? It's a very difficult book. It's not well written. It's unclear in a lot of points. If you've been reading it and rereading it like me, boy, since graduate school, so going back to close to 30 years, it's still difficult, but it's not a 10 anymore. Books that I haven't read by other tricky authors might be more difficult. I have to do more work with them, right? You see how relative it can be. So you don't want to buy into like ratings or stuff like that. If people are giving you specific advice about how long this book should take it with that proverbial grain of salt. If they give you a schedule and they're like, here's your reading list for how long it's going to take you to get through this text. Week 1 we're doing this, week 2 we're doing this. That might be okay for them, but you don't know. It all depends on the circumstances that we're in. And the other thing to keep in mind, if somebody makes claims like, I read, and we'll quit picking on Hegel, I read Heidegger's Being in Time over the course of a month, over Christmas break. I read through the whole thing. Well, okay, so they read it in the sense of they turned each page and they ran their eyeballs over each line of the text, maybe, or perhaps they skimmed it, right? People do that when they read texts. And you don't actually know what they got out of it. You're not sure yourself whether what they read really stuck with them, how well they understood things, whether there were references later on in the text that they went back to and actually checked out, whether they read the footnotes, or you don't know any of that stuff unless they tell you. And they could be lying. You don't actually know whether they read the whole book or not. Not just students lie about that. I'll let you in on a dirty little secret. Academics lie about that sort of stuff as well. There's lots of books that, quite frankly, I know some of my colleagues will mention, but when I talk with them about it, I'm pretty sure they haven't actually read that book very carefully, because they say, things that are clearly wrong about the book. Or if they read it, maybe they misread the book. So you don't really know. And you can't ask professors either. How long should this book take me? Why? Because they're going to lowball you most likely, unless they're trying to like impress you with how difficult the work is. Oh, Heidegger's Being and Time is going to take you years to read, Well, there might be something a little self-serving. I've read it, therefore I'm so smart, right? You don't know whether that's the case. I think more likely if you ask a professor or a grad student and they're not trying to like impress you, they will tell you that it takes less time than it's going to require you because they're forgetting about the fact that they've got a leg up on you, right? And so they're going to underestimate the amount of time that you would want to devote. And even if they give you a useful prescription, things can change over time. So here's where we get to like talking about differences between people. So every one of you is going to have your own kind of schedule for how you read a text. Some of us are fast readers. Some of us are slower readers, right? To read the same amount of material. Some people, when they're reading, they're like getting everything as they're reading it. Some people have to go over it several times. Some people take notes, right? Other people don't take notes. If you're taking notes, that's going to slow down your reading time. Some people have more background knowledge. I can read some philosophical texts that I've never had, in front of me before, quicker than probably most of you, because I've got a greater background knowledge to draw upon. So, if I'm reading a new work that I've never read by some secondary lit person on the Stoics, and they're referencing this and this and this and this, well, I've read the Stoics, so I know what they're talking about. That might take you a bit longer to work through. And there's no actual like multiplier or timetable or schedule for that sort of thing. It also makes a difference whether you're reading a text for the first time, coming to it cold, or whether you're rereading it. If you and I were going to sit down and read Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, which I have probably read, I don't know, at least 30, 40 times in my teaching career, if I reread it attentively, it's going to take me less time than it's probably going to take you reading it for the first time. These are all important factors. Are you consulting secondary resources? I mean, if you're watching my videos to try to understand a text, that takes time, right? That's going to slow you down, which is not to say that you shouldn't do it. Or if you're listening to podcast episodes, or if you're reading secondary literature, or if you're checking out online encyclopedia entries on the thing. All of that might actually make for better reading for you, but it's going to add to the amount of time that it takes. So you are going to have the amount of time that it takes you to read something and understand it. Somebody else is going to have a different amount of time, and you don't need to worry about what they're doing or if you're falling behind or if it's taking you too long, because there isn't a too long for you. There is the right amount that it takes for you to actually understand the text at the level that you want to. There's also a difference in thinkers and the texts and the genres. For example, to go back to Hegel, the phenomenology, I've read it quite a few times. I've done the half-hour Hegel project, which took me almost 10 years. If you give me the phenomenology and you're like, you got to read this thing cover to cover, I would probably go through it pretty quickly. I've read the Philosophy of Right, several times. I actually find that a lot easier than the phenomenology. I enjoy it more, by the way, too. If you give me the Science of Logic, which is a cool text, that's going to take me a lot longer. That is more difficult stuff for me, and maybe even more difficult generally, right? If we're talking about Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics, I don't know how many times I've read it. Could be 100 times at this point. That's kind of a breeze for me. if I got to read stuff that I'm not particularly interested in, like the prior and posterior analytics, which I find kind of dry, it's going to probably be more of a chore. I'm not going to get into it as much. And, different authors take different amounts of time, in part because they're not all great writers. Some of them are harder to read. It's easier to read Schopenhauer or Nietzsche than it is to read Hegel because they're better writers, I would say Heidegger's kind of in the middle there, right? And we could go on and on. Now, that is also going to be a matter of how you, as the reader, respond to the text. I find reading Descartes a joy, and I really, get a lot out of every reading of the Discourse or the, Passions of the Soul or the, Meditations. I can tell you that sure as hell wasn't the case when I first read them as an undergraduate and couldn't figure out what the hell was going on in those texts, right? So there's going to be some significant differences, and they will be partly about the author and their work and how they express themselves, maybe even how the translation. If you're reading something that comes from Greek or Latin or German or French or Italian or Spanish, it really a lot depends on who's translating it and how good of a writer they are and whether they wrote in an Oxfordy sort of way that you can't yourself relate to with all sorts of funny words that nobody uses in contemporary English, or whether you got a more recent translation that's speaking your vernacular, right? These are all important factors. I think another thing to keep in mind is it's not just how much time per week or per day you are deciding to devote to the text. It's also what else is going on in your life. Do you have the luxury of being able to just read and study and think about stuff? Or do you have a job, and do you have responsibilities? And do you have neighbors who are, making noise next to you? Or do you have a cat who wants to jump in your lap and knock the book down or stuff like that? All of these things affect how long it takes you to read something. And I would say it's also, are you trying to multitask as you read? Some people do better having the TV on or music on while they're reading. Other people need silence. And, or you can read in a coffee shop, but you can't read in the quiet of home, or vice versa. These are important considerations as well, and they're going to lengthen or shorten the amount of time that you need to read a particular section or a whole work. So, can we actually give you any guidelines? I mean, yes, I can tell you it's going to take you longer to read Camus' Myth of Sisyphus than it's going to take you to read Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, and Heidegger's Being and Time is going to take longer than either of those, and Augustine's Confessions will take less than Being and Time, but more than Camus' Myth of Sisyphus. But, exactly how much time, we don't really know. As professors, we get to play around with this a bit, right? We can put them into the schedule for classes that we're teaching and see what actually works and what doesn't work. And I'll tell you that I have changed the amount of reading that I assign per week, depending on who the students are, what level they are, where I'm teaching, from semester to semester. Sometimes even after teaching, I've been teaching now for, I think, close to 25 years. Even after that, I still screw up. And I'm like, well, we didn't get through everything that we were hoping to this term, or we got some extra time left over. Let's do some other stuff. We figure this stuff out pragmatically, and it's just, at best, rules of thumb. So don't feel like you are on anybody else's timetable. Here's the bottom line. You figure out what works for you. When you're reading philosophical texts, if you need to spend more time to read a work that other people seem to be getting done more quickly, good for them, good for you. And it is good for you. You get what you need out of the text. And don't let anybody tell you that there's something wrong with you or that you shouldn't be spending as much time as you choose to on those texts. It's your life, it's your brain, it's your reading, so you call the shots with that. So that's the last thing that I want to say. I just want to reaffirm that if it takes you longer to read a text than what other people are reporting, there's nothing wrong with you, and you don't even know if they're really being truthful or accurate about that. So you take whatever time you need, and you decide whether you are finding what you're reading valuable and interesting and stimulating for yourself.